Climate. Seattle has a temperate climate, classified in the Mediterranean zone by the main climatic classification, but some sources put the city in the oceanic zone. It has cool, wet winters and mild, relatively dry summers, covering characteristics of both. The climate is sometimes characterized as a modified Mediterranean climate because it is cooler and wetter than a true Mediterranean climate, but shares the characteristic dry summer. Temperature extremes are moderated by the adjacent Puget Sound, Greater Pacific Ocean, and Lake Washington. Thus extreme heat waves are rare in the Seattle area, as are very cold temperatures. The Seattle area is the cloudiest region of the United States, due in part to frequent storms and lows moving in from the adjacent Pacific Ocean. With many more rain days than other major American cities, Seattle has a well-earned reputation for frequent rain. In an average year, at least 0.01 inches of precipitation falls on 150 days, more than nearly all cities east of the Rocky Mountains. However, because it often has merely a light drizzle falling from the sky for many days, Seattle actually receives significantly less rainfall overall than many other cities like New York City, Miami, or Houston. Seattle is cloudy 201 days out of the year and partly cloudy 93 days. Economy. Seattle's economy is driven by a mix of older industrial companies and new economy internet and technology companies, as well as service, design, and clean technology companies. The city's gross metropolitan product was $231 billion in 2010, making it the 11th largest metropolitan economy in the United States. The Port of Seattle, which also operates Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, is a major gateway for trade with Asia and crosses to Alaska. It also is the 8th largest port in the United States when measured by container capacity. Its maritime cargo operations merged with the Port of Tacoma in 2015 to form the Northwest Seaport Alliance. Although it was affected by the Great Recession, Seattle has retained a comparatively strong economy, and is noted for start-up businesses, especially in green building and clean technologies. In February 2010, the city government committed Seattle to become North America's first climate-neutral city, with a goal of reaching zero net per capita greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Large companies continue to dominate the business landscape. 7 companies on Fortune 500's 2022 list of the United States' largest companies are headquartered in Seattle: internet retailer Amazon, coffee chain Starbucks, freight forwarder Expeditors International of Washington, department store Nordstrom, forest products company Weyerhaeuser, online travel company Expedia Group and real estate tech company Zillow. Other Fortune 500 companies commonly associated with Seattle are based in nearby Puget Sound cities. Warehouse club chain Costco, the largest retail company in Washington, is based in Issaquah. Microsoft is located in Redmond. Furthermore, Bellevue is home to truck manufacturer Packer. Other major companies headquartered in the area include Nintendo of America in Redmond, T-Mobile US in Bellevue, and Providence Health and AMP Services in Renton. The city has a reputation for heavy coffee consumption. Coffee companies founded or based in Seattle include Starbucks, Seattle's Best Coffee, and Tully's. There are also many successful independent artisanal espresso roasters and cafes. Before moving its headquarters to Chicago and then ultimately Arlington, Virginia, aerospace manufacturer Boeing was the largest company based in Seattle. Its largest division, Boeing Commercial Airplanes, is still headquartered within the Puget Sound region. The company also has large aircraft manufacturing plants in Everett and Renton. It remains the largest private employer in the Seattle metropolitan area. In 2006, former Seattle Mayor Greg Nickels announced a desire to spark a new economic boom driven by the biotechnology industry. Major redevelopment of the South Lake Union neighborhood is underway in an effort to attract new and established biotech companies to the city, joining biotech companies Corixa, Immunex, Trubion, and Zymogenetics. Vulcan Incorporated, the holding company of billionaire Paul Allen, is behind most of the development projects in the region. While some see the new development as an economic boon, others have criticized Nickels and the Seattle City Council for pandering to Allen's interests at taxpayers' expense. In 2005, Forbes ranked Seattle as the most expensive American city for buying a house based on the local income levels. Owing largely to the rapidly increasing cost of living, Seattle and Washington State have some of the highest minimum wages in the country, at $15 per hour for smaller businesses and $16 for the city's largest employers. Operating a hub at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Alaska Airlines maintains its headquarters in the city of SeaTac, next to the airport. Seattle is a hub for global health with the headquarters of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, PIATH, Infectious Disease Research Institute, Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, and the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. In 2015, the Washington Global Health Alliance counted 168 global health organizations in Washington state. Many are headquartered in Seattle. History. Founding. Archaeological excavations suggest that Native Americans have inhabited the Seattle area for at least 4,000 years. By the time the first European settlers arrived, the people occupied at least 17 villages in the areas around Elliott Bay. The first European to visit the Seattle area was George Vancouver, in May, 1792, during his 1791 to 1795 expedition for the Royal Navy to chart the Pacific Northwest. In 1851, a large party of American pioneers led by Luther Collins made a location on land at the mouth of the Duwamish River. They formally claimed it on the 14th of September, 1851. 13 days later, members of the Collins Party on the way to their claim passed 3 scouts of the Denny Party. Members of the Denny Party claimed land on Alki Point on the 28th of September, 1851. The rest of the Denny Party set sail on the schooner Exact from Portland, Oregon, stopping in Astoria, and landed at Alki Point during a rainstorm on the 13th of November, 1851. After a difficult winter, most of the Denny Party relocated across Elliott Bay and claimed land a second time at the site of present-day Pioneer Square, naming this new settlement Duwamps. Charles Terry and John Lowe remained at the original landing location, re-established their old land claim and called it New York, but renamed New York Alki in April, 1853, from a Chinook word meaning, roughly, by and by or someday. For the next few years, New York Alki and Duwamps competed for dominance, but in time Alki was abandoned and its residents moved across the bay to join the rest of the settlers. David Swinson Doc Maynard, one of the founders of Duwamps, was the primary advocate to name the settlement Seattle after Chief Sile, chief of the Duwamish and Suquamish tribes. A modern transliteration of the original Coast Salish settlements around Elliott Bay is rendered in Lushootseed as Diddley. The name Seattle appears on official Washington Territory papers dated the 23rd of May, 1853, when the first plats for the village were filed. In 1855, nominal land settlements were established. On the 14th of January, 1865, the legislature of Territorial Washington incorporated the town of Seattle with a board of trustees managing the city. The town of Seattle was disincorporated on the 18th of January, 1867, and remained a mere precinct of King County until late 1869, when a new petition was filed and the city was reincorporated the 2nd of December, 1869, with a mayor-council government. The corporate seal of the city of Seattle carries the date 1869 and a likeness of Chief Sile in left profile. That same year, Seattle acquired the epithet of the Queen City, a designation officially changed in 1982 to Emerald City. Timber Town. Seattle has a history of boom and bust cycles, like many other cities near areas of extensive natural and mineral resources. Seattle has risen several times economically, then gone into precipitous decline, but it has typically used those periods to rebuild solid infrastructure. The first such boom, covering the early years of the city, rode on the lumber industry. During this period the road now known as Yesler Way won the nickname Skid Road, supposedly after the timber skidding down the hill to Henry Yesler's sawmill. The later dereliction of the area may be a possible origin for the term which later entered the wider American lexicon as Skid Row. Like much of the American West, Seattle saw numerous conflicts between labor and management, as well as ethnic tensions that culminated in the anti-Chinese riots of 1885 to 1886. This violence originated with unemployed whites who were determined to drive the Chinese from Seattle. In 1900, Asians were 4.2% of the population. Authorities declared martial law and federal troops arrived to put down the disorder. Seattle had achieved sufficient economic success that when the Great Seattle Fire of 1889 destroyed the central business district, a far grander city center rapidly emerged in its place. Finance company Washington Mutual, for example, was founded in the immediate wake of the fire. However, the Panic of 1893 hit Seattle hard. Gold Rush, World War I, and the Great Depression. The second and most dramatic boom resulted from the Klondike Gold Rush, which ended the depression that had begun with the Panic of 1893. In a short time, Seattle became a major transportation center. On the 14th of July, 1897, the S. Portland docked with its famed ton of gold, and Seattle became the main transport and supply point for the miners in Alaska and the Yukon. Few of those working men found lasting wealth. However, it was Seattle's business of clothing the miners and feeding them salmon that panned out in the long run. Along with Seattle, other cities like Everett, Tacoma, Port Townsend, Bremerton, and Olympia, all in the Puget Sound region, became competitors for exchange, rather than mother lodes for extraction, of precious metals. The boom lasted well into the early part of the 20th century, and funded many new Seattle companies and products. In 1907, 19-year-old James E. Casey borrowed $100 from a friend and founded the American Messenger Company. Other Seattle companies founded during this period include Nordstrom and Eddie Bauer. Seattle brought in the Olmsted Brothers landscape architecture firm to design a system of parks and boulevards. The Gold Rush era culminated in the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition of 1909, which is largely responsible for the layout of today's University of Washington campus. A shipbuilding boom in the early part of the 20th century became massive during World War I, making Seattle somewhat of a company town. The subsequent retrenchment led to the Seattle General Strike of 1919, the first general strike in the country. The 1912 city development plan by Vegelbogd went largely unused. Seattle was mildly prosperous in the 1920s but was particularly hard hit in the Great Depression, experiencing some of the country's harshest labor strife in that era. Violence during the maritime strike of 1934 cost Seattle much of its maritime traffic, which was rerouted to the port of Los Angeles. The Great Depression in Seattle affected many minority groups, one being the Asian Pacific Americans. They were subject to racism, loss of property, and failed claims of unemployment due to citizenship status. Seattle was one of the major cities that benefited from programs such as the WPA, CCC, UCL, and PWA. The workers, mostly men, built roads, parks, dams, schools, railroads, bridges, docks, and even historical and archival record sites and buildings. However, Seattle faced massive unemployment, loss of lumber and construction industries as Los Angeles prevailed as the bigger West Coast city. Seattle had building contracts that rivaled New York City and Chicago, but lost to LA as well. Seattle's eastern farmland faded due to Oregon's and the Midwest's, forcing people into town. The famous Hooverville arose during the Depression, leading to Seattle's growing homeless population. Stationed outside Seattle, the Hooverville housed thousands of men but very few children and no women. With work projects close to the city, Hooverville grew and the WPA settled into the city. A movement by women arose from Seattle during the Depression. Fueled by Eleanor Roosevelt's book It's Up to the Women, women pushed for recognition, not just as housewives, but as the backbone to family. Using newspapers and journals Working Woman and The Woman Today, women pushed to be seen as equal and receive some recognition. Seattle's University of Washington was greatly affected during the Depression era. As schools across Washington lost funding and attendance, the UW actually prospered during the time period. While Seattle public schools were influenced by Washington's Superintendent Weth Mixler, they still struggled to pay teachers and maintain attendance. The UW, despite academic challenges that plagued the college due to differing views on teaching and learning, focused on growth in student enrollment rather than improving the existing school. Seattle was also the home base of impresario Alexander Pantages who, starting in 1902, opened a number of theaters in the city exhibiting vaudeville acts and silent movies. He went on to become one of America's greatest theater and movie tycoons. Scottish-born architect B. Marcus Pratica designed several theaters for Pantages in Seattle, which were later demolished or converted to other uses. Seattle's surviving Paramount Theater, on which he collaborated, was not a Pantages theater. Post-war years, aircraft and software. War work again brought local prosperity during World War II, this time centered on Boeing aircraft. The war dispersed the city's numerous Japanese-American businessmen due to the Japanese-American internment. After the war, the local economy dipped. It rose again with Boeing's growing dominance in the commercial airliner market. Seattle celebrated its restored prosperity and made a bid for world recognition with the Century 21 Exposition, the 1962 World's Fair, for which the iconic Space Needle was built. Another major local economic downturn was in the late 1960s and early 1970s, at a time when Boeing was heavily affected by the oil crises, loss of government contracts, and costs and delays associated with the Boeing 747. Many people left the area to look for work elsewhere, and two local real estate agents put up a billboard reading, "Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?" Seattle remained the corporate headquarters of Boeing until 2001, when the company separated its headquarters from its major production facilities. The headquarters were moved to Chicago. The Seattle area is still home to Boeing's Renton narrow-body plant and Everett wide-body plant. The company's credit union for employees, BQ, remains based in the Seattle area and has been open to all residents of Washington since 2002. On the 20th of March, 1970, 28 people were killed when the Ozark Hotel was burned by an unknown arsonist. As prosperity began to return in the 1980s, the city was stunned by the Wami massacre in 1983, when 13 people were killed in an illegal gambling club in the Seattle Chinatown International District. Beginning with Microsoft's 1979 move from Albuquerque, New Mexico, to nearby Bellevue, Washington, Seattle and its suburbs became home to a number of technology companies including Amazon, F5 Networks, Real Networks, Nintendo of America, and T-Mobile.